Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Ryan Heckman, the CEO of Rallyday Partners, and this is the Founders Journey podcast. We'll explore the heart and soul of great founders and their journey to build the company of their dreams. You will learn about new industries and business models while discovering how to apply the founder's mindset to your everyday work and life. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Founders Journey podcast. I'm Ryan Heckman, and joining me today, distinct pleasure and honor to be welcoming Dan Caruso. Welcome, Dan.
Well, I am so excited to be here. This is going to be fun.
Funny enough, Dan has a podcast. Dan, tell us the name of your podcast and how you came up with that name.
Well, the name is The Bear Roars, and my nickname that I guess I earned was The Bear. And when I earned the nickname The Bear, it wasn't because I was a cuddly bear. It was because I was a bit of a grizzly bear, easy to set off, had pretty thick claws. So I turned out embracing the nickname, and I'm also known to roar a little bit too. So The Bear Roars.
And we're going to poke that bear today. And the funny part of the story is that we just got done. He interviewed me for his podcast, and now I'm interviewing him for ours. And we flipped a phone. He's picked screen side up, and it went the other way. And he went first interviewing me because I wanted to be able to ask some really tough questions, and I didn't want any revenge questions coming out of him. So
we can edit the previous one, right? Use a little AI to spark it up we need to.
Well, I'm going to really get you. For those of you who don't know Dan's career, I'll give a brief sort of story. But Dan built a business here in Colorado called Zayo, Z-A-Y-O. It's a public company for many years. He built Zayo from literally zero of EBITDA to over $1 billion of EBITDA. So if you look at our podcast history, clearly the winner of the biggest value creation that's ever been on our very modest, humble podcast, The Founder's Journey. And so cool that we have someone sitting here with us today that started with zero. I mean, there aren't many founders who can take a business from zero to over $1 billion of EBITDA. You would almost say, very typically, that the same CEO that's good for 0 to 10 million in revenue would be a terrible CEO at scale. And I think the remarkable part of Dan's career that I've always admired is that he was able to grow as the business grew. And on that basis, from 0 to $1 billion of EBITDA, it's just mind blowing. Dan is a family friend. He's a role model of mine. He's a confidant of mine. Dan is massively invested in the Colorado community today. He is widely regarded as probably one of the most admired CEO and business people in our state. So if I didn't know him as well as I do, I would be asking him for his autograph. He's also tonight here at our...
Well, if you ever get around to buying my book, maybe I'll sign.
Well, I was just going to say, that's like a good segue. Tonight here at our office, he just debuted his book called Bandwidth. That debuted 2 days ago, or was it yesterday?
Yeah, Tuesday.
On Tuesday.
3 days ago, 3 days ago.
And Bandwidth chronicles the whole story of the telecom industry, not just in Colorado, but dare say in the world, because most of it started here. And Dan and many of his colleagues and close circle of incredible entrepreneurs built the telecom industry. And tell us the byline of the book just real quick.
So the byline is the untold story of ambition, deception, and innovation that shaped the internet age, that created the .com boom. So we didn't invent telecom, but we did largely, we meaning the broad group of people are part of the story, many of which were associated with the things I was doing, and many of them weren't. But us together took what was nothing other than a monopoly of AT&T that just got broken apart, and a world that didn't have the internet, a world that didn't have mobile phones, and we built the infrastructure of the digital age. We built the fiber networks, the internet backbones, and what the book is about is not the technology, not the specific business plans. It's about the people, the characters, some of which were heroes, like gigantic heroes, bigger than life heroes, many of them in Colorado. Phil Anschutz is a big hero in the story. John Malone plays a big role in the story. But the story also contains people who did bad things and got exposed for what they were doing, and ended up spending the better part of the rest of their life in jail. But it's also a story of perseverance, because the story of the industry is a hero's journey. Hero's journey meaning you have this hero that kind of works the way through, achieves a lot of success, suffers a lot of failure, and somehow comes out as the hero in the end. And the industry is the hero. But there's also an underlying kind of hero's journey of sorts, which is my story as a storyteller and how I kind of, rode the wave up and crashed along with the wave and had to claw my way back as well. So I had to almost tell two stories intertwined with one another.
I cannot wait to read it. And especially because I think it was probably 2.5 years ago, you told me I'm going to write this book. And I was like, you are crazy, Matt. We're going to get to the telecom industry. We're going to get to your book, but the focus of our podcast is really the hero's journey as it relates to being a founder and the stories that are so distinctive to founders who may started with zero and created very special businesses, maybe elevated industries along the way, had some mistakes, some texture. And so we're going to talk a bit about...
I like that word texture in that context. What I had is texture.
So we're going to talk about your journey and your path, but I also want to get to some of your more vulnerable sides because I agree, Dan Caruso, guys, does have a reputation for being a bear. There's just some funny things like there's a term of art called a nanosecond, which basically is like less than a nanosecond when he wants stuff done. Danimal is another word. Carusify is one of the worst ones I've heard. And I know that you take that with lightheartedness, but I also know that you've got other sides to you that are incredibly different than the bear roars, but more like the bear hugs.
Well, can we keep that to ourselves?
And so we're going to talk a bit about the different versions of Dan. So version 1 is Dan's a incredible family man. Dan's involved in the community. Dan built this huge business. And Dan is one of the most loyal friends that anyone could ever have. So one of the things I'd like to start with, Dan, is how you grew up. And I'd like for you to spend a little bit of time talking about your buddies from Chicago, because I think that's going to get us in the right mood. Because when you're with those guys, you're a different Dan than the guy who built Zayo.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about the way you were raised and how that informed your business philosophies as a starting place, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So, I get the question, like we all get the question, what sports did you play growing up? Did you play baseball? Did you play football? And every time I'm asked that question, I cringe a little bit because, the only answer I could give is, yeah, I played in the park and pickup games. But as far as organized sports, I didn't play any. And it's, people look at me and they're like, well, you didn't play football? You look like you would have played football. And, I do consider myself, good athlete, certainly good enough to play on the high school level. But from a very young age, and my dad was never into sports. That just wasn't anywhere close to his thing. He didn't talk about it. He didn't watch it. Certainly didn't play it. So although he never said you have to go out there and work, from as long as I can remember, 12 years old, I worked and worked multiple jobs. By the time I was, I think either 13 or 14, I was already the manager in charge of the busboys at a major banquet hall, which as best I can remember, it was illegal to work when you were 14 years old. Yet, that's what I did. And the guy promoted me almost immediately and I was in charge of my own schedules. I had to get people to show up, make sure, we kept up with the work. So I learned how to work, through many, many different types of jobs and pretty much all the time. But I maybe didn't get as much out of the social aspects of growing up that I could have or should have. And, I was an Italian kind of lifestyle. The firstborn son is viewed one way and, the secondborn son is often viewed differently. It's just so ingrained in the Italian heritage. Like, for example, my dad was a firstborn son. The secondborn was expected to be a priest from the time he was born. And he ended up being a priest for a number of years until he pulled out of priesthood. And that's just the way it was. And as I reflected back, I think there was that dynamic going on as well, that, that I was the second born son and you just get viewed differently. So for whatever set of reasons, I developed kind of a need to kind of prove myself as
kind of that chip on your shoulder kind of a thing.
So you had that aspect. And I think the other aspect is, so I've had to do a lot of reflections when I was thinking about and writing the book. So, I had to deal with kind of, what was really going on, what drove me and what made me get on the journey I was on and maybe prevail the way through. Maybe the other aspect too was more looking at my family circumstances growing up. And I touch on this really briefly in the book. And, an uncle, Guido Marconi, who was the baker, and I had an uncle, Nicky Rapani, who was a butcher, and I had my godfather, who was the barber, and the whole family just, that's the kind of stuff they did. They weren't professionals. They weren't white collar. They didn't know that world. My dad was sort of crossing into that world. He did go back and get a college degree after working a couple of years, but he was kind of a first line person at the phone company, but there were really no role models for what you do if you're not, if you're going to do something other than kind of a traditional job. And therefore I had to kind of figure things out on my own.
Yeah. So, I mean, you could say you came from a humble family and you had to create higher expectations for yourself. And you also busted your ass and worked a lot.
But it's kind of strange when I reflect on it is that there wasn't, I think a lot of people in a similar situation, it's really important to the family, the parents that, I'm going to give my kids, what I didn't have, I'm going to want them to go achieve these things. I don't really as much remember that in our past. It was kind of like, yeah, you probably should go to college, but I don't remember there ever being conversations or behavior along the lines of, man, maybe you could go be a lawyer, maybe you could go be a doctor, maybe you go run a business. I don't think there was any of that in our upbringing, which makes me feel very fortunate to, for whatever set of reasons, to come out of that with this desire to do something more significant.
And you went to undergrad and you got a degree in mechanical engineering. Is that right?
I did, but there's a underlying story there that I share in the book, and that is, I wanted to go to engineering because I looked up and saw engineers were the highest paid job, but I didn't know anything about what engineers did. I didn't, I didn't have a relationship with my dad where I'd go to my dad, who was sort of an engineer, and say, hey, what do engineers did? He would have thought I was stupid if I would have asked that question, I guess, or maybe he just wasn't around for those kind of conversations. But I decided to go into engineering anyways. The problem was I didn't have the grades like you to get accepted in the engineering program, so I got rejected. And then I had to, over the stern warning of my counselors at University of Illinois, I got into their liberal arts school, and I said I was going to go into engineering. They said, don't even try.
Yeah, not going to happen.
Take all the wrong classes, and you're going to have to kind of get 4.6 out of 5.0. We were a 5.0 schedule. And if you don't, you're going to have all these math and chemistry and physics where you got subpar grades, and then what are you going to do? So I had to, go forward without anyone telling me that's a good idea.
That's the first time that bear roared.
Yeah.
Was at University of Illinois.
Yeah.
And I take it you eventually got into the engineering school and
Yes.
did just fine, right? I mean,
yes. Yeah, I did just fine. Took me 5 years to get a 4-year degree. So it depends on your definition of just fine, but
depends on what you're doing with that other year. Maybe they were having some fun, but I think this is true, but I think the University of Illinois has more Fortune 500 CEOs than any college in the United States. I think that's true. We'd have to fact check that, but it has produced some amazing leaders and CEOs over the years. I know that.
Yeah. And the engineering program was, I think, number one public engineering at the time, and it's certainly way up there today, public or private. It was a serious engineering school.
And did you go straight from undergrad to doing your MBA at Booth, University of Chicago, or did you work a little bit between your engineering degree and when you went and got your MBA?
Now, when I was leaving, undergrad, I made probably half of the best decision that I could have possibly made, and the other half, we'll get to in a little bit. But the half was to choose to get into this rapidly changing field called communications. So to put in perspective, this was I graduated in 1986. In 1983 is when AT&T was told, you need to break up, you need to create kind of other companies, and we're going to let competition come after you. And 83 was also the year that is credited as being the year the internet was born. So
when Al Gore made it?
Yes, when Al Gore took credit a few years later, but it was actually what marked it was adopting internet technology called TCP/IP, Internet Protocol, into kind of the packet network of the day called ARPANET. That's when they declared the birthday of the internet, even though there was a prehistory of that I cover in the book. But I jumped in that industry and I got into a management development program. And ironically, my first paycheck said Illinois Val, talk about archaic. But they put me in a management development program, which allowed me to start to see kind of how the end-to-end way things work in the communication world. And the second half of that, one good decision was recognizing that I was more cut out to be on the side that attacks the competition than the side that defends it, and was able to join one of the earliest and most important competitors to the Bell system, that being Chicago Fiber Optics, that was renamed MFS Communications. So those two together set me on the course that allowed me to take full advantage of this industry dynamic change that really lasted my entire career.
And at that time, I mean, I know that it would be easy to say, yes, I did. But at that time, did you know that it was going to be such a big deal? Or was it more like, this is cool, I think this is going to grow? And did you have the vision?
A lot of things that happened to me happened by a kind of happenstance, like, get to a fork in the road and you could have gone left, you could have gone right, and it wasn't clear which was the right one, but it turned out to be the right choice. Okay. But in this particular case, there was more to it than that. There was the realization that I had insight from some of the activities I had in college that things are changing dramatically in the communication world. And we were only at the beginning of it, and it was going to be a wild ride. We didn't use the word internet. We didn't really even talk about data back then. but we knew that all these things were starting to happen. So I deliberately said, I'm going to go in the industry and be part of massive change.
That is incredible. So you did MFS was the company, and then did you go to get your MBA at that booth? Well, I was just trying to connect that dot.
Yeah, in a very kind way. Before I jumped ship to attack the monopoly paid for my MBA at University of Chicago. So I went to University of Chicago at night, the MBA program, while working at what was originally Illinois Bell, but Illinois Bell was part of one of the baby bells called Ameritech. So I moved down to Ameritech corporate development, which started to give me the world of like M&A and the world of financing and the world of funding kind of earlier stage companies. I was able to kind of get a big taste of that while getting the MBA at night, which is what inspired me to say, I need to get on. I don't want to be part of this side of the equation. I want to be part of, the other side.
Then you met Jim Crow?
Yes.
And tell us about that.
Yeah. So Jim Crow was the guy who was hired to build out the fiber network for Chicago Fiber Optics. Kiewit, the gigantic construction company, won that contract. Jim was assigned to lead it. The company, Chicago Fiber Optics, ran out of money real quick. And Jim convinced Kiewit to back him to buy Chicago Fiber Optics, rename it MFS. So when I joined them, they were maybe into year 3 of this wild ride. So the expansion had begun, but it was early. And I had the benefit of jumping on the roller coaster as it was already kind of beginning its wild ride and get to ride alongside it. And Jim was the intellectual leader, the thought leader. Even though he wasn't old, he came across as like an elder statesman or a university professor. And then he had this right-hand guy named Royce Holland. Royce was the polar opposite. He was one who, would be out there, the face of the company, always, attacking the Bell system as being, the greedy monopolists who are taking all of our money and giving us shitty service and, spending time at their country clubs and their fancy suburbs. But we're there to, attack the monopoly and bring kind of freedom to those who need communication services. So it was a Batman Robin type duo that really attracted me to the company and who I was able to learn from.
And did you spend more or less time with either one of these fellas, or was it equally distributed, would you say?
Well, Jim was not in Chicago. He was in Omaha. And even though we were a small company, this was a different world back then. He still had, corporate hierarchies and bureaucracies. So my biggest first recollection of Jim is a story I tell about in the book, which is called The Internet. And what Jim did is he sent notes out to about 30 of the senior-most team at MFS. So this is maybe 2 years after I started, but I'd risen up really quick and somehow I made the cut. But we didn't know it was called the Internet. We didn't really know much about what the Internet even was back then. So we sit in this room and he gets out in front. He connects a computer to a screen, which back then, executives didn't do. They would have maybe an underling do it, but usually it was transparencies. But he connects his computer and he starts getting on the internet and showing us, searches and other stuff. But he had a very stern message to everyone in the room after taking us through Toro. He's like, I know what some of you guys are thinking. You're thinking, why are we wasting our time, with this toy called the internet? It's cute, but it has nothing to do with what you're doing. And I get it. Maybe you're an old dog and you don't want to learn a new trick. And that's the choice that's available to you. But I'm going to ask one favor of anyone in the room who's thinking that way. And that is, please resign from the company as soon as possible because you're not welcome here. And then I want to talk to the rest of you in the room who are willing to recognize that the internet's going to change everything and that you want to be part of it. Here's my promise to you guys. If you make that decision, you will have the opportunity to be a valued employee here. An opportunity, So like either choose to do this and be part of the team and see how it works out or get the hell out of our way. And that always stuck with me.
That is incredible. Did people opt out?
No, I think a lot of them were, word technology literate and probably thought it was silly. And they thought Jim was kind of an abstract leader anyways. And they wanted to go hang out with Royce because he was more fun to go out drinking with. So maybe I'm the only one in the room that took it that seriously, but it was certainly, impressed something upon me that, I took all the way to the rest of my career.
I mean, the amazing thing is that from that humble beginning, became level 3 communications.
Well, you're skipping an important chapter in between there, which is a real important one. And that is MFS. We're going to come back to number 14.3 later, I think. MFS sold itself to WorldCom for $14.3 billion. WorldCom is the company that was maybe the biggest villain of a lot of villains.
Bernie Marcus, correct? Is that
Bernie Evers.
Bernie Evers, sorry.
Bernie Evers, who was lauded as the best CEO on Wall Street with the best whiz-kid CFO on Wall Street. Well, it turned out they were cooking the books. And when WorldCom bought MFS, most of the senior MFS team kind of moved on right away. They weren't part of the deal. But they wanted me to stick with it, so I didn't get my options accelerated, and so I stuck with it. But I was asked by the CFO, who spent a number of years in jail, to be kind of the subject matter expert on a accounting transaction they wanted to do that. Coming out of University of Chicago, I knew just wasn't right, and I said I wouldn't do it, which I knew at that point any possibility of a career at WorldCom was over. But that's when I left there to rejoin Jim Crow, Kevin O'Hara, and be part of the team that moved out here to Colorado and launched Level 3 Communications.
Okay. I misunderstood because I was pretty young at that time in my career, but I thought part of Level 3's assets were MFS, but that's not true.
No.
Did you guys start at Level 3 from pretty much scratch, or?
Yes. We start from scratch with, I kid you not, $2.5 to $3 billion of capital behind us and literally no business plan. And it was even worse than no business plan because there's kind of like a pretending there was a business plan stage where Jim would share these big thoughts about the world and, IP internet protocol, interfacing with the phone network called SS7. And we were going to change all this and we were going to deploy fiber. So there's this big story, but there wasn't a business plan. It's like, okay, that's great, but what are you really going to do? And where are you going to do it? And how are you going to do it? And who's going to do it? None of that, had been talked about, let alone solidified. So there was kind of a moment that I talk about in the story. And importantly, the story is not about me. I'm certainly a thread in the story. The story is about much more dramatic, and names like Phil Anschutz and Joe Naccio and Bernie Ebbers and Jim Crow and Craig McCaw and, John Kluge out of Metro Media fame. So there's all these bigger than life characters who are part of it, but I'm able to tell a part of the story from a vantage point where I was kind of in and around all this stuff, and at a young age, being firsthand kind of color to what was going on.
Well, how old were you when Level 3 started?
Probably early 30s.
Early 30s. And who gave you the $2 or $3 billion?
Well, Kiewit did.
Kiewit did.
And the reason we did is we made so much money for them on MFS. So when we sold the WorldCom, they made an absolute killing. So they wanted to go and try to strike gold again. And they're like, we'll give you all the money. You could tell us what you're going to do with it afterwards.
Well, I mean, they trusted Jim too. Like, yes. He had been in Kiewit for probably a couple decades, huh? I mean, by that time?
Yeah, decade and a half, maybe.
Okay, yeah.
A decade and a half.
And Jim, he passed away in 23?
Yes.
Very, very, like in the fall of 23, is that right?
It'd be July of 23.
Okay.
And I know that because I didn't start researching the book until literally right after his passing. It's what triggered me to say, you know what, someone needs to do this. I kind of wanted to do it if I knew it was going to be a ton of work, but the whole story of where the infrastructure came from, and more importantly, all the blood, sweat, and tears that so many people, both that I knew and that were around people I knew, everything we did and dedicated life to was just one big cloudy story that never got the attention that maybe it deserved, as far as it being so transformational to the world we live in. So, his passing is what inspired me to get serious about working on the story.
And fast forward us a bit, but I mean, Level 3 became like a really hot company. Tell us about that. And what role did you have at that time, and how did you guys grow? And I mean, for all intents and purposes, that was kind of your first real startup, and it became like gold.
Yeah. So, MFS, even though it started before I got there, it was early, and I got to experience what a scale-up journey looks like. But Level 3 was as ground floor as you get. It's, getting around a business table, conference room, and say, okay, what are we supposed to be doing? And trying to figure it out.
What did Level 3, where did the name come from? Because it sounds like it was Level 0.
Yeah. So Level 3 is, you're right. Level 3 has to do with the stack of communication. It's called the OSI layers, where we get to layer 7, which is the high layer. That's where applications live. And layer 0 is the land that a building's put on. So you kind of work your way up, and Level 3 is the IP layer.
Got it.
So layer 3 became Level 3 for us.
Did Jim name the company?
Of course he did. In fact, he misnamed the company because he initially named the company L3 Communications. So we started our branding campaign, and we're all excited. We still have hats to say that have the 3 in there, only to find out that there's a company called L3 Communications, and they weren't too happy about us taking their name. And they were far bigger, and they said, not going to happen. So
what was the scale of Level 3 at its peak, and how did you play a role there?
It was one of the most important companies in the development of the internet. We were the biggest internet backbone of that era. We were the biggest internet backbone at MFS during that era too. But from scratch, we We were able to build the biggest internet backbone, the biggest fiber network to this day.
Is that measured in route miles? How do you guys, what's the unit of measure that, just to give people a sense?
Yeah, internet is the amount of traffic, and fiber network would, I think if you exclude residential, although back then there wasn't much fiber in residential, it's just the quantity of fiber you have in the ground. So really on either measure. And the company at its peak was worth maybe, including debt, 60 or $70 billion. At its peak, somewhat humbly, I will share that I was worth 130 million, and probably 40 or 50% of it was vested. And I sold almost none of it because I was just working too hard and didn't really pay much attention to that stuff, which is really stupid. But it was a high flyer. I mean, we went from nothing, to being kind of one of the hottest companies alongside the other real hot companies. But, the bigger you are, the harder you fall, kind of situation. We, like everyone else, went crashing down.
And that was in 01-ish?
02, 03 is when the big crash hit. The peak hit right around 01. And then a series of bankruptcies hit everyone in the industry in a very short period of time. Trillions of dollars of value that was created. Many billionaires on paper that were created all went to zero or close to zero. Level 3 is one of the very few to not have to go through bankruptcy for kind of pretty creative financial engineering maneuvers. But pretty much everyone did. And a lot of them did because a lot of the book is about what a boom bust cycle is all about and how they get rebirthed, which is very relevant today with, what's going on with AI and soon to be quantum. But the internet, just like AI is today, was so obvious. I mean, the internet was going to change the world. We all agreed on that. But when you see something that powerful and that obvious, everyone wants in on the gold rush. So money comes pouring in. It's easy to raise money. You tell big stories. The problem is the investment cycle can get way ahead of itself. And when that becomes clear, the party ends and everything comes crashing down. But you also find out that a lot of, the key people involved with it were doing some bad things with their accounting, with their storytelling, with their trading behavior, not matching up to what they were saying about.
Too many private equity guys going.
Yeah. Well, these were also corporate guys as well back then. So the stories of kind of how it all came collapsing down and what happened and how intertwined it was is a big part of.
Big story.
Yeah.
And tell us, so you left level 3. It wasn't immediately that you started Zayo, was it? Did you take a couple years off? And tell us when your idea for Zayo came to your mind, or however that happened, and what was your vision for the business, and what was the big idea?
So when I left level 3, I didn't leave under the best of circumstances. We all had lived through the real stressful crash. We clawed our way out of it, and we were getting on a much better track. And that was a big part of us kind of getting back on the right track again. But, there was a lot of scar tissue we were all carrying, a lot of baggage we were all carrying. It was still very stressful, and we were coming off of years of, working around the clock. So when I left, it was, and the industry was still in shambles. So when I left, it wasn't clear what I was going to do next. For every person looking for a job as an executive in the industry, there'd be like one job for every, 500 people is my guess, because so many industry just collapsed. So there wasn't, a lot of places to go. And I didn't fully realize that when I left, and I found out on our side, like, holy cow, the demand for someone with my background is like close to zero.
And there's a lot of supply.
But fortunately, I had a few friends who kind of pointed me the right direction. And there's a company in South Denver that's called ICG. I don't know if you ever came across that. There's it's
on 925.
Yeah. It kind of was designed as a ship hub looking westward. And it was one of the big stories of the fiber internet era. And it collapsed into bankruptcy after John Malone led a round of $500 million within 6 or 7 months. They burned through all that money and they were bankrupt, and they came out of bankruptcy, tried to make the business work, maybe with some kind of false assumptions about what was really going on. And then they were about ready to go into a second bankruptcy, a public company about ready to go into second bankruptcy. And, I finally figured out where my calling was, and that is a CEO job that no one else wanted. So I was able to work with some private equity guys to buy the company before it went through bankruptcy for pennies on the dollar. And we were able to take $8.7 million, and within 2 years turn that into $250 million. So a massive exit through a very aggressive kind of first collapsing the companies, shutting down a bunch of stuff they shouldn't have been doing, then get focused on where they had value, and then monetize that value by combining pieces of it where they better belonged. So it was a big financial success story, but it wasn't very fulfilling from the perspective of we kind of, the business needed to be torn apart, but tearing apart a business, unless you want to be a restructuring guy, is not
You
rewarding.
went full Donnie Mall on that
Yeah,
business.
exactly. And it was fun from a success standpoint, but I recognized I disrupted countless people's lives in the process. So when we came out of that, we now had a ton of investor support. Industry was still struggling. People still didn't look at fiber as a smart way to invest money, but my investors did, and I did, and we conceived of the Zayo plan as being, hey, we got this window of opportunity where the asset class is still out of favor, but we know there's a ton of value there. We just got to go digging for it, find these fiber companies who ended up with these assets, who are running their businesses, give them a fair price because you couldn't buy them at distressed prices. But fair prices today are going to look like a bargain 5 years from now. And that's what we went out and did.
And that vision is unbelievable. And how many add-on acquisitions did you do during your tenure?
We probably did 45 acquisitions altogether. And what was interesting is we started Zayo in 2007. And, most of us who are probably seeing this probably can remember 2008 and 2009. It was the Great Recession. So money was really hard to come by there. But that turned out to be to our favor because we came across another investor, Charles Bank, that I built a relationship with. They wanted to get in on something I was involved with, very sophisticated private equity investors. So their thesis was, Dan, you're going to know what to do with this money. And this is going to be an opportunity to buy really good assets at really favorable prices. And they led a Series B round at a time where almost no one was investing in general, let alone in the fiber world.
That's incredible. So you bought all these assets, you built this business, it had like $1 billion of EBITDA, a little over. Took it public what year?
2014.
And what did that feel like?
It felt fantastic. I mean, I won't sugarcoat it. It felt like, we did something. We a team of people who worked really, really hard, and we achieved something. We built a brand. We built a franchise that was going to be durable, something that was unique, whether this is a good emotion or not, that part to the side. But I also built the biggest rival to my previous company, Level 3, which felt good as well, that, I was able to, starting from nothing, they had a 10-year head start, starting from nothing, was able to build what is to this day the biggest rival of Level 3 is now under the umbrella of Lumen. But Lumen and Zayo are by far the two biggest providers of digital infrastructure, bandwidth infrastructure, certainly in North America, but, the tentacles stretch well beyond that.
And did you call Jim after you went public, or did he call you? What was that like?
It's funny, and maybe this is like a culture thing, but not as many people would do that kind of stuff as you would think they would. But one of my most enjoyable moments with Jim was probably sometime after we went public, so maybe 3 or 4 years after that. And, I sparked this, not Jim, but wanted to, go out to dinner to honor Jim. So, and he was all for it. So it was Jim, me, Don Gibbs, and maybe one other person. And we had dinner at one of the restaurants by the train station. What's the one real nice one there?
Oh, the Chop House, maybe?
No, what's the one that was...
Adega? Or was it?
Yeah, I can't remember the name of it, but in the new...
Near Union Station.
Yeah, Union Station was newly reopened back then. So we had, I think, one of the most enjoyable dinners. We were a little worried about how Jim was going to get home because the martinis were flowing that night, and we were able to reminisce, and it was always remember how good that felt to make the dinner about him, because he too, like a lot of people, he didn't get the full recognition that he really earned, because his ending at Level 3 was a little bit chaotic, and maybe it wasn't kind of the ending that he would have hoped for, or we all would have hoped for. And the role he played in the industry from beginning to end is probably more important than any other single person. Yet he wasn't viewed that way, given credit for that like he deserves. So in some respects, this book is also to kind of honor and recognize his legacy.
Well, God bless you for taking the time. I mean, I think we all are guilty of getting on these treadmills or these journeys that we're on, and we forget to take those time to have those dinners and say thank you, or, whatever you said to him, that I'm sure was very, very touching. All right. So you built the business, took it public, and then not very recently. How many years ago was it, Dan, when Zayo went private?
Yeah. So 2020, right as the pandemic hit, is when we closed the deal. But the sale, it took over a year to close the deal because of all the regulatory processes. So think of 2019 early, we sold it and then closed on it in early 2020.
Okay. So you're 5 years into your afterlife from Zayo. What are you most proud about as it relates to Zayo, besides the obvious? I mean, geez, $1 billion of EBITDA. I still can't get my head around that. But what are you proud about?
Yeah. So we say $1 billion EBITDA. You could buy a business that has, lots of EBITDA and get to $1 billion. Relative to the financial, and this isn't what I'm most proud about, but relative to the financials, the $1 billion of EBITDA, to get there, we invested about $1.1 billion of equity. When we sold the business, that $1.1 billion of equity was worth $8.5 billion. So we made just incredible returns for every stakeholder, including, lots and lots of people who've been part of the management team. The amount of, millionaires, multimillionaires, I don't know what you call a millionaire that's worth more than 10 million, more worth more than 20 million.
Happy in any event.
Happy. I mean, in the hundreds and with a high concentration in Colorado. So certainly I was proud of kind of the shared success. Even my investors would tell the management team that the amount I shared with others was way beyond I needed to and way beyond what you'll see in other companies, which, I feel good about. I feel really good for the investors because, like you said in our earlier conversation, if you're doing really well for your investors and you have the right structure, you're doing really well for everyone. And the investors, in many, many cases, this is their kind of number one, or at least it was at the time, performing investments. So certainly there's some pride in that. But the biggest thing, as I've had time to reflect, is the more subtle difference I made and we made as a team in the lives of so many. The notes I get, sometimes they're notes sent just to me, but now with the book, I've seen some people actually post, on LinkedIn, kind of the journey. And there was one, in particular recently where the person started out with, I barely knew Dan. I only crossed paths with him in this meeting and 17 years ago and that meeting 12 years ago. And I was never part of Zayo, but let me tell you the difference what he did made in my life. And when you see that and people share their stories, another person sent me one, again, very recently because of the book, I think just yesterday or the day before. And she grew up in Russia, either Russia or Ukraine, but I think Russia. And she sent me a picture of her husband, her kids on her Christmas tree in the house paid for by Zayo Equity in a town 20 minutes outside of Aspen. And like, without Zayo, none of this would have been possible. So you get reflections like that. And and there's a little bit of like, feels so good now to see that. Why, I have to ask myself, could I have seen that earlier on? And would that have affected kind of who I was earlier on in a positive way to recognize when I was 30 years old or 40 years old, how important that part of your legacy would be. It's kind of the all important part of maybe your business legacy is the relationships you built, the difference you made in other people's journey and those who made a difference in your journey. That's what you're going to remember, not anything else. And you're either going to feel good about that or you're going to feel regret about that. But that's what really matters.
Yeah, that's powerful. What regrets do you have?
Yeah, that's a complicated question because if I was writing that Frank Sinatra song, it had been regrets I have a lot, not regrets I have a few. If you focus on very specific things, you certainly can, have a long list of things you wish you would have done differently. And many of which you kind of, you could kind of really beat yourself up over, like you could cringe over and say, man, I can't believe to get something done, I did it the way I did it, that kind of stuff. But I also have to recognize that probability of me, based on the way I was born and who I was, the probability of me getting from wherever I started to the person I am today, you weren't going to get there on a straight line of, doing things, not just with a great outcome, but doing them, quote unquote, right every step along the way. Being unpredictable is often played to my advantage, including in deal doing. Well, part of being unpredictable is open yourself up to people criticizing you, to critiquing you, sharp elbowed, aggressive, no hills too high to climb, all that comes with a baggage too. Not everyone thinks that way or can respond that way. And when you're bringing people with you in those kind of tough situations, for every person you bring with you, there's probably 10 you're leaving behind. The ones that are being left behind don't like sit there and admire the ones who went up there. They think, you left them behind. And, so you got to kind of just, process who you are with all that in mind.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's just like with age comes, at least what I'm hearing from you and for myself, I look at my biggest strengths usually are my biggest challenges with maybe interpersonal relationships and, the collateral damage that can come from driving too hard is like pretty common, I think. And I agree with you too, that like you wouldn't have created Zayo. Zayo wouldn't exist if it weren't for the positive sides of that. But for every positive, there's a negative. And
Yeah, it's, it's hard to come up with examples of people who've been phenomenally successful, in areas where they've significantly changed something, who also didn't have significant character flaws. I mean, all the most obvious ones certainly have big character flaws. So, anyone who says, "Well, yeah, but Elon Musk should be a nice guy too," and Mark Zuckerberg shouldn't have been so weird, and Jeff Bezos, he's kind of a whatever, like
Steve Jobs wasn't a great leader
yeah,
or whatever, right?
yeah, you think you would have paid attention to any of their names if it wasn't for those, character flaws that maybe drove them to accomplish what they accomplished.
That's fascinating. What did you admire in Jim Crow as a leader? I mean, obviously his vision was unbelievable, but are there other parts of his role modeling that you took to your Zayo life? And who else have you looked up to over the years? And who have you tried to emulate and in terms of your own leadership style and approach to things?
Yeah, I never, and I say this with lots of regret, I never really had a mentor that was kind of a long lasting mentor so I could really turn to. But I've had people who've been a big part of my journey and a big part from a 360 perspective, like people who were part of my team who I could really rely on and learn from and kind of get through the hard parts together with. So without mentioning names, there's 3 or 4 just are vivid. Some of my investors that were investors in both ICG and then Zayo, my early investors were absolutely like, I don't know if I'd call them role models, but they were absolutely extremely important partners of mine that helped shape kind of the success that we had together. Jim was a role model, but from a distance, because he was a very distant person. He wasn't the kind of guy you go out to dinner with and hang with. He had a circle that he did it with, but the circle he did it with really weren't the ones who were part of the day-to-day business. It was a little different. So I kind of admired him more from afar, even though we had a direct relationship for certain as well. But he was, as you said, more of the visionary, the big idea guy, was able to raise the money. But when it came to kind of what are you going to really do, the operating side, the execution, he was a fish out of water, frankly. That wasn't his specialty. And if he started to get involved with it, it was probably going to make things worse than make things better. So he didn't really get that involved in the day-to-day business, which is kind of what I was mostly doing. But there are others too. Kevin O'Hara was, in many ways, we had kind of a little bit of I say it was kind of my feisty older brother, or so there's a little bit of rivalry type of relationship, and things didn't always go smoothly. But I wouldn't be who I became if it wasn't for his influence as well. So there were a lot of people who played very important roles, but not that 1 or 2 or 3 that were the standout. I learned a lot from people who did things wrong too. Because I had extremely direct visibility into a lot of the bad things that were going on, and I was able to watch and learn from that as well.
Kind of reverse role model.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Including importantly, and maybe this is maybe I have a little bit more of a knack for this, is kind of having a sense of how they got off track, because the ones who got way off track, it wasn't because they were fundamentally bad people who were set out to, deceive everyone and profit from it. It was kind of things started to happen, and there's choices that they could have made, early on, but it would have been really hard to choose, the path that wouldn't have gotten them into trouble. It's kind of like if I would have personally, said yes to what they wanted me to do. At the time, it might have been a relatively small thing, but it would have set the course where the next one would have been bigger and bigger, and then my role in it would have been bigger. And before you know it, I'm the one who's trying to not end up in jail.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of them, they weren't necessarily out to do it the wrong way. They just got caught up in
And
things.
kind of just snowballed on them.
Yeah. And so kind of having a sense for, how things could go wrong. And I think that in a big way influenced Zayo. Like when we started Zayo very early on, I came up with the owner's manual that's very similar in context to the Warren Buffett Berkshire Hathaway owner's manual. Like if you're going to be a stakeholder in Zayo, here's, a 10-page document on what you should expect. And I published that as an appendix in the book, and it all talked about here's how we're going to go about doing things. And
what was number 1 on the list?
I'm going to remember the number 1 as being around, and this one mimics Warren Buffett about treating your investors as partners. But the theme of it is that we're going to really focus on true value creation. The true value creation, we're going to be transparent. We're going to be honest. If things aren't going well, you're not going to have to figure it out on your own. We're going to share that with you. We're not going to exaggerate the value of the company because that's not fair to the new investors. So we're going to do our best to share information in a way where both those who are current investors as well as those who are potential future investors can get a sense of what's really going on. So commitment to transparency, true value creation, to the stakeholder dynamic between employees, customers, and investors, that the win scenarios is the scenario that we win together, not investors do real well and employees do bad, or we all want to be customer focused, but we're not, the customer focus is in the context of the investment performing well as well. So striking kind of a good balance between all of our stakeholders.
Yeah, the harmony of the
harmony,
stakeholders.
the win-win-win kind of dynamic.
Fast forwarding to today, so I mean, you're 5 years out, you have a family office now that makes a number of investments, and you're evaluating businesses every day and the leaders that run those businesses. What are some of the characteristics, Dan, that you look for in founders and CEOs that you think result in the best outcomes for stakeholders? What are some of the things you look for?
Yeah, I mean, we both share an admiration for Professor Steve Kaplan at University of Chicago. And he's was known for finance. He was my professor. He's also known for entrepreneurship leadership, but he also does this analytical study that he has access to these databases that can be correlated, where one database has to do with what CEOs got funded and what was their outcome. But did they have a successful financial outcome or not, on a spectrum. But another database about those same CEO leaders is how did they score in kind of a management test. And I think it's actually based on GH Smart data. So how did they score on there before they became CEOs? And then how did other people score on them that became CFOs, not CEOs? So if you correlate those two, what was the best outcome and how did that correlate to their profiles? What profile turns out to be a great CEO? Not what you think and what your intuition tells you, but what does the data tell you? So he had a vast database and did that. And it turns out in some ways, very surprisingly, in some ways, when you think about it, not at all. What makes a great CEO, if a great CEO means financial outcome, is the kind of characteristics you think of when you think of an Elon Musk or a Steve Jobs or a Jeff Bezos. It's this kind of tenacity, this ruthlessness, this evolving vision that says we are going to go conquer something that, is otherwise unconquerable. And they get everyone, they kind of go off and they're going to go conquer that, and they're going to see who's coming with them. They're not going to try to talk you into it. They're going to see who joins them. And as they start their march, they realize, okay, maybe that wasn't the best idea. Who cares? We're going to pivot and go this way. And who's still with me? And, they're not afraid to kind of take advantage of a feedback loop and change direction, even if that opens them up to criticism. But what's not correlated to that is things that we think of as soft skills or EQ. They're not, the best communicators. They're not, they don't rally people together. Other types of leaders do that, but not these transformational leaders that create enormous value. So I believe that to be true. Obviously, you don't want to be funding people who aren't ethical, who aren't good people, but you got to look past kind of the aspect that says, do they have the right soft skills? You got to focus on, for the business that they're doing, are they going to do everything in their power to produce a successful outcome? Because if they don't, they're probably going to be watching someone else who's also smart, also hardworking, kind of get to the finish lines and leave them behind. And by the way, the other aspect too is just what they call just fundamental kind of IQ or intelligence. That's the other thing that is a really strong correlation. People who are just abnormally kind of intelligent might have really poor EQ, but abnormally intelligent, and then these, kind of the tenacity, it's those characteristics. So as we're observing what we're doing in our portfolio, what's working or not, I think you're putting more weight into who the leaders are and why you're picking the leaders, and be willing to pass on things where you don't, see the right leadership characteristics. It's got to be a good idea and a good market, but a really good idea and a middle of the road leader is probably not going to produce a good outcome. A good idea, not a great idea, but a good idea and an incredibly capable leader when it comes to that value creation dynamic, one way or another, is probably going to produce a pretty good outcome, maybe a great outcome.
Yeah. The way I would answer that a little bit too is like, you can have a CEO who has those flaws, as you call them, but they have these incredible strengths. You can always put a team around them that can manage parts of the business that they either don't like doing or they're not very good at, or, otherwise can scale their vision without them having to be good at everything. Because the reality is
they're not going to conquer whatever hill they're trying to conquer by themselves. Sometimes they might take too much of the glory in the process, but you're exactly right. I mean, if you say what makes a great CFO, it's going to be a totally different characteristic than what I just described. And one thing great leaders do is they surround themselves by great people around them. And quite often it's people with different profiles, not mimicking their profile. So you got to look at it as a team, not an individual. This is most obvious in sports or in entertainment. The most talented people, the LeBron James, the Patrick Mahomes, even in NFL, top 6 or 7 quarterbacks versus other NFL starters, is such a big gap. It's so hard. The best coaches, once you get past the first 5, 6, 7, 8, there's this crazy drop off. And you think, how could that be possible? I mean, there's, millions of people who could be an NFL coach. Why can't you find 26 just fantastic NFL coaches? Well, once you get those 26, there's still going to be a big difference between the top tier and the next tier. And, that's obvious when you watch sports. It's obvious when you're being entertained in a movie but it's less obvious and maybe less socially acceptable to also see that's true in business.
Yeah, I get that. We talked about that in our conversation, the likability thing and so forth. Obviously your book came out on Tuesday. You've got your family office rolling. What's got you excited otherwise now as we end this conversation? What's got you excited? And my last question after you answer that one is just, what advice would you give other founders that are listening to this podcast today?
Yeah, what's got me excited, I'm doing a lot of reflection now about my team. You call it family office. It's, the latest trend with like Silicon Valley and I think in the tech ecosystem is when either venture capitalists have big exits and they move on from their venture firm, or the tech CEO has big exits and they move on from their companies, is they form kind of family offices, but it's not like traditional family offices. They're very kind of investment forward. They want to be direct investments. They want to be involved. They put significant money to work. And quite often they put money to work in either the geographic community they care most about or kind of something related to an interest level that they have. So in our case, we focus on Colorado, but we also focus on industries that are really interesting in Colorado, like quantum and like space tech, as well as other variety of kind of venture type investments. So we are migrating toward direct investing as opposed to investing in as an LP, limited partner in other people's funds. Also have a foundation that's pretty significantly funded. And so I have a young team that's growing up together, and we say, what do we want to be when we grow up is kind of our theme. Because if we fast forward 2, 3, 4 years, we're going to have a lot of liquidity. And, I want us to have time to kind of grow into both the capability, but also where's the passion going to lie and how's that going to outlive me? So how is what we create going to transition from me being kind of a focal point to start to be in the background while the team kind of builds something that could be its franchise for the next, 20, 30, 40 years.
That is indeed exciting.
Yeah.
Advice. You get a couple bullets here, and then I think you have to go put on a show next door for your new book. But 2 or 3 minutes, just riff on if you're a founder out there, maybe they're struggling, maybe they're kicking ass, but you've done it all. I mean, you've built a business with $1 billion of EBITDA.
Yeah.
What advice would you give us aspiring Dan Caruso's out there?
First and maybe most important, it's the journey that matters. Yeah, you want the culmination of your journey to be a great outcome that may happen and may not happen. But regardless of where you are in that, you were talking earlier about how you're providing leadership modules, not just for kind of the C-suite, but for people who are part of the team because of how important they are. So, this advice can be to kind of a founder and a leader, but it also can be to people who want to be part of an entity that's creating something. Just always know at the end of the day, it's the journey that you'll remember. And it's the people who are on the journey either with you, maybe they're on the same side of the table, maybe they're your rivals, but it's those relationships, those impacts that you're going to remember more so than anything else. So think about that often, think about that daily. Who do you really want to be? Who are those people around you? What's your relationship with them? How can you achieve success together? That's what's going to matter at the end of the day.
Perfect. Well, thanks for our friendship. I would say, number one, thanks for being on this podcast. Thanks for sharing your story with other aspiring founders. And thank you for everything that you've done for the state of Colorado. You've always been an inspiration to me, and I really look up to you. And thank you for sharing all this with our listeners.
All right. Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to do so.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Ryan.